The Pope and the Dalai Lama are both the heads of significant international religious traditions, both are widely respected and admired spiritual leaders, and both offices have, at points in the distant past, wielded enormous religious and political power. But how far do those similarities actually go? Is the Pope to Roman Catholics the same as the Dalai Lama is to Tibetan Buddhists? My name is Dr. Alexander K. Smith. I'm a specialist in Tibetan and Himalayan history, and I've also worked on the history of the Catholic Church in the past. And what I want to do today is walk through some of the most significant similarities and differences between the two offices, not focusing on individuals, not on this Pope and that Dalai Lama, but on the positions of Pope and Dalai Lama themselves, how each one is selected, how they wield religious authority differently, and some of their historical and political dimensions. And just a quick heads up, this is a revised version of an older video with the same title. I made a few minor mistakes in that one that I wanted to clear up, so let's roll a title card. Now, starting with the respective roles and titles, the Pope is considered to be the apostolic successor to St. Peter and is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. That's not all Christians, of course, but it's over an estimated 1.3 billion people, which is roughly half of the world's practicing Christian population. By contrast, the Dalai Lama is considered to be an incarnation of the Bodhisattva of compassion, or Chenrezig in Tibetan. He's also not the head of all Buddhist traditions around the world. He's one of the principal spiritual leaders, many would say the spiritual leader of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, which, despite being significantly smaller than the Catholic Church, plays a very pronounced role in the history of Buddhism and has grown over the last 70 years to become one of the most recognizable forms of Buddhism in the world today. Now, something that you'll often hear people say is that the Dalai Lama is also the head of the Gelug school, one of the major sects of Tibetan Buddhism. And this is a bit pedantic, but that is not actually true. The Dalai Lama is not the acting administrative head of any of the major sects of Tibetan Buddhism. This is a point that we'll circle back to later, but historically, the power of the Dalai Lamas was more directly political than religious in nature, although some historical Dalai Lamas did grow to become extremely respected and influential religious figures in their own right. There are some significant differences here in the way that the Pope and the Dalai Lama are each selected, starting with the papacy following the death or the resignation of a pope, which is rare but has occurred on several occasions. The College of Cardinals will convene a closed-door, highly secretive meeting known as a papal conclave, in which a number of candidates are put forward and the College of Cardinals votes to select a new pope. If the conclave fails to reach a 2/3 majority, then no candidate is selected, and they continue debating and voting until a 2/3 majority is reached. And this process can take anywhere from one day to, in the most extreme case, nearly 3 years before the election of Gregory X in the 13th century. But as soon as the candidate accepts the conclave's results, long before the coronation mass and all of the fanfare, they become the new pope, the Bishop of Rome, and the head of the Roman Catholic Church. By contrast, the Dalai Lama is selected through a completely different process. The Dalai Lama is not elected, he's technically recognized through a process called the Choku Lamluk, or the Choku system. One of the core beliefs in Tibetan Buddhism is a belief in reincarnation and the idea that certain highly accomplished Buddhist masters have taken a vow to continue to be reborn on earth again and again in order to help other people achieve enlightenment. A choku is considered to be the reincarnation of one of these masters, who's then educated and trained to occupy the same office as their earlier incarnation. This creates a system of succession through recognized reincarnation that, since the 13th century, has been one of the cornerstones of religious authority in the Tibetan Buddhist world. So after a Dalai Lama dies, a group of senior monks is sent out to search for his reincarnation, and when a suitable candidate is found, the monks then test them in a number of different ways, the most famous of which is a ritualized process that involves the child identifying various objects from their previous lives. And in general, all this means that the new Dalai Lama will always be a child, or at least someone very young, necessarily born after the death of the previous Dalai Lama, while the new pope will always be someone significantly older. So there's a huge difference here between the limits of the religious authority exercised by the Pope and the Dalai Lama. The Pope has supreme authority in the Catholic Church. He defines doctrine, appoints bishops, and can speak ex cathedra. These are official declarations concerning faith and moral conduct that are considered to be infallible and that are also binding on all Catholics around the world. Now, many aspects of papal infallibility were only really defined and codified in 1870 at the First Vatican Council, so the nature and perception of the Pope's infallibility within the Catholic Church has actually changed and evolved over time. But by contrast, the Dalai Lama has much more limited religious authority. While he is often seen as the spiritual leader of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Tibetan Buddhism is not at all centralized like the Catholic Church. Each Tibetan Buddhist sect has its own leadership and monastic traditions, which can vary significantly from one to the other, and its own interpretation of core canonical texts. So while the Dalai Lama does, of course, have enormous influence, there's no such thing as, Dalai Lamic infallibility, no equivalent of speaking ex cathedra, and certainly nothing like the kind of supreme religious authority that you find in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, moving on to their historical and political roles, at points in the past, the Pope and the Dalai Lama have both wielded enormous political power, and there are some really interesting similarities with regard to how that was done. Starting with the papacy, throughout much of the history of Christianity, the Pope has been the unquestioned spiritual head of the Catholic Church. And in that role, he exercised political power through a combination of absolute religious authority, which we've already covered, as well as enormous wealth that was accumulated through land ownership, tithes, which were taxes levied on all members of the Christian faith, and perhaps more than anything else, donations from wealthy individuals and institutions from across all of Europe. This gave the Roman Catholic Church considerable political power, of course, but the Pope had some additional tools at his disposal, a kind of soft power that allowed him to exert even more influence over the Catholic nations of Europe and later of the world. In the Golden Age of the papacy, for example, during the reign of Innocent III, the Pope could very easily do things like publicly bless or denounce the monarchs of Christian nations, sometimes to dramatic effect. He could use the threat of excommunication to pressure or exert influence over kings, or as Pope Gregory VII did, for instance, use interdictions to compel European monarchs to change their national policies and laws. The papacy also served as an arbiter between Catholic nations, mediating their disputes, settling treaties, and even renegotiating national borders. You can look up the Inter Caetera or the Dudum Siquidem to see two examples of how this was done historically and the ways that it expanded the Pope's already considerable influence over the Catholic monarchs. Now, the Pope was also a head of state. For many centuries, he served as the political leader of the Papal States in central Italy, and later of Vatican City, but the real political power of the papacy came through its influence over the Catholic nations of Europe, which could be indirectly controlled or sometimes directly compelled to act by the Pope himself. In a similar way, many historical Dalai Lamas were also religious and political leaders, but they wielded their political authority a bit more directly than the papacy within the context of Catholic Europe. Now, I'm going to use some Tibetan terms here, so pay attention. It's going to be on the test. But in traditional Tibetan political theory, generally speaking, there are two types of governance, two types of power. The first is religious rule, or Chödrön, which is based in Buddhist principles and practices and backed by the authority of the major monasteries and their considerable wealth. And then there is the rule of kings, of physical political power, Gyaltrim. This is often called Siwang today, literally meaning secular authority. And this is a bit of a generalization, but from the mid-17th century onwards, these two forms of authority were combined in the office of the Dalai Lama. This meant that the Dalai Lama was, in theory, invested with political power as a head of state and legitimized by a very high but not infallible form of religious authority. And the Dalai Lama was responsible for the administration of the army and enforcing laws in the same way that he mediated conflicts between the monasteries and the major sects of Tibetan Buddhism. And similar to the way that the papacy exerted influence over Catholic monarchs, At points in Tibetan history, certain Dalai Lamas were able to secure wealthy and powerful patrons outside of Tibet, who occasionally intervened in the politics of the Tibetan state to advance the interests of the government of the Dalai Lamas. One of the most famous examples would be the relationship of the third Dalai Lama, Sonam Gyatso, and Altan Khan, the leader of the Tume Mongols in the 16th century. Now, in the modern world today, the role of the Dalai Lama in particular is very different than it was in the past. In 2011, the 14th and current Dalai Lama, His Holiness Tenzin Gyatso, officially divested himself and future Dalai Lamas of all direct political power. In effect, he stepped down as the political leader of Tibet and handed his political authority to a democratically elected official called the Sikyong. But the Dalai Lama has retained his spiritual authority and is still very much the figurehead, the embodiment of Tibetan Buddhist traditions in the eyes of Tibetan Buddhists around the world. Thank you for watching. There's honestly a lot more that I could say, but I don't want this little video to get out of control. As I'm recording this, it is the night of May 5th, 2025, about 48 hours before a papal conclave convenes to elect the successor to Pope Francis, who recently died. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to share my thoughts in this moment as a historian and also shine a light on some of the unique historical similarities between the Pope and the Dalai Lama. If you watch this channel at all, you'll know that my specialization, my focus is in Tibetan and Central Asian history, but I also grew up as a very devout Christian. Now, that is very different today. I am a secular social scientist, but the history of the church is near and dear to my heart. It's one of the first subjects that I really took seriously when I began to study history, and that interest has continued to the present day. So, if you have any additional questions or you'd like to know more about, any of the examples I raised in passing, please do let me know in the comments, and I'd be happy to share some reading with you or just, chat and expand on my remarks. Now, with that said, I want to take a quick moment to thank all of my patrons, all of these wonderful people here. And if you would like to join them and support independent science communication on the platform, you too can visit our Patreon to learn more about what it is that we do. And what we do is great. Even when we're doing it at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, trying desperately to get a video out before a papal conclave convenes to elect a new pope. But all of that aside, genuinely, thank you so much for watching. Wherever you are, whatever you do, I hope you never stop learning.